Zara Ashfen never imagined that one night could destroy everything she had ever known. She was only an Omega, the weakest rank in her pack, living a quiet life in the mountains she had called home since birth. But when she returned to the pack grounds after a peaceful night in the forest, she found nothing but fire, blood, and silence. Her family was gone. Her pack had been wiped out. No one cared enough to search for answers. No one feared the people responsible. And no one expected the lone surviving Omega to do anything about it. But grief can become something dangerous when it has nothing left to lose. Alone and hunted, Zara sets out on a path that will shake the werewolf world itself. What begins as a search for the truth soon becomes a brutal war against the powerful alpha force that destroyed her home. They thought she would break. Instead, she became the one thing they never saw coming. If this story has already found its grip on you, you are in exactly the right place. Subscribe now and follow every chapter through to its end. Hit that subscribe button. Like and comment where you are watching from. Now let's begin the story. The Grey Peak Mountains did not warn you when something was wrong. That was the first thing every pup in the Ashfen pack learned before they learned to shift, before they learned the territory boundaries or the pack laws or the hierarchy of ranked wolves. The mountains gave you nothing. They were not kind. They had no loyalty. You survived them or you did not, and the only mercy they offered was the same mercy they offered every creature that moved through them, the freedom to try. Zara Ashfen had loved them for exactly that reason. She loved that the ridgeline asked nothing of her rank. She loved that the stones did not care whether she was Omega or Alpha, the lowest wolf or the highest. She loved the cold mineral smell of the upper passes in late autumn, the way the trees thinned near the summit and you could stand at the crest and feel the wind try to take you, and you leaned into it, and you were still standing when it gave up. She had been up near the summit the night it happened. Alone, the way she preferred, tracking the silver-wing moths that only appeared in the hours just before dawn when the temperature dropped sharply enough to call them out of the deep forest. She was not supposed to go that high on her own. Her mother had told her this. Her father had told her this. Her elder brother Dace had told her this with the specific authority of a wolf who was 4 years older and had just been promoted to mid-rank beta and believed this gave him jurisdiction over her habits. She had gone anyway, because the moths only appeared near the summit, and because freedom was something she had always preferred over permission. She was 19 years old. She would later understand that this night marked the last hours of the person she had been. The descent took her 40 minutes in the dark. She knew every stone, every root, every place where the path turned treacherous after rain. She came down through the lower canopy moving quickly, her wolf senses threading through the dark with the ease of a creature born to this terrain, and the first wrong thing she noticed was the smell. Not smoke. Not immediately. The smell came before the smoke. It was something chemical, something that did not belong to the forest or the mountain or any natural thing. She slowed. Her bare feet found the earth differently now, her body lowering by animal instinct rather than decision, the way all wolves lower when the air changes. Then she crested the ridge above the valley and understood. The settlement below was not the warm cluster of lit windows and banked fires she had left 3 hours before. The longhouse was burning. 2 of the family lodges were already collapsed. The great meeting circle where the pack gathered on ceremonial nights was a ring of fire, every carved post alight, the years of their history burning upward into the dark sky in thick black columns that bent in the mountain wind. Zara stood at the crest and stared. Her wolf did not howl. Her wolf went entirely still, which was worse. She went down the ridge at a speed that was not safe, leaping from rock to rock, her feet finding purchase by instinct while her mind ran ahead of her body and kept arriving at the same place it could not accept. She was counting. Every member of the Ashfen pack occupied a specific place in her internal geography, the way landmarks occupy a map you have memorized. Her mother. Her father. Dace. Her younger sister, Wren, who was 13 and had recently shifted for the first time and was so proud of it she had barely spoken of anything else for 2 weeks. The Aldrich family, 7 members, whose lodge sat nearest the creek. Old Mira, who was the pack historian and had lived through 3 alpha transitions and said she intended to live through 3 more. 41 souls in the Ashfen Valley, and as Zara ran she tracked them the way you track lights in a storm, hoping. She found the first body at the border of the settlement, a patrol wolf named Kos who had been her brother Dace's closest friend. She did not stop. She could not stop. She kept moving through the burning wreckage, through the heat and the smoke and the smell that she would not name, calling names into the air, her voice coming out raw and breaking. She found her mother near the longhouse door. Her father 10 feet beyond, between the door and the fire circle, as though he had been moving toward the sound. Her sister Wren was in the place where the younger wolves slept, curled as if she had simply gone to sleep and the world around her had decided to end without waking her. She found Dace last, near the eastern boundary stones. He had made it furthest. He was the strongest of them, and it had not mattered. Zara sat down in the ash and the dark and she did not move for a very long time. The thing about grief, when it comes that large and that sudden, is that it does not feel the way people tell you it will feel. It does not arrive as the wave they describe. It arrives as absence. As a subtraction so total that the remaining space is simply silence. Zara sat in the ruins of her pack and felt the silence press against her from all directions, and for a long time she was no more than a point in the center of it, unable to expand, unable to move outward into the space where decisions are made. The moon was low by the time she stood. She was still standing in the same position her body had found in the ash, straight, hands at her sides, chin level. She had not wept. She did not understand yet that this was not strength but shock, the body's first mercy when what has happened is too large to process in the immediate window. She would cry later. She would cry for days, in the kind of sobbing that bends the body double and leaves you wrung out and hollow and barely able to breathe. But in those first hours, she was simply a wolf standing in the remains of everything she had come from, and her mind was very quiet, and very cold, and very clear. She began to walk the perimeter. She was an Omega, which meant she was the lowest ranked wolf in the pack hierarchy, which meant she was not trained in combat or investigation or the tactical reading of damage. What she was trained in was people. Omegas read the emotional state of a pack the way navigators read weather, and this sensitivity did not turn off simply because the people were gone. She moved through the wreckage the way she had always moved through a crowded room, reading the evidence of what had been, tracking the shape of what had happened. The destruction was systematic. That was the first thing she understood. This was not a raid that had spiraled out of control. This was not opportunistic violence. Every structure had been targeted. The boundary stones, which marked Ashfen territory and carried the pack's collective scent claim, had been smashed with something heavy and deliberate, not simply knocked aside but destroyed, so that the territorial record was erased. The archive lodge, where old Mira kept the pack history, had been burned first and specifically, while the living lodges had been burned after, which meant that whoever had done this had understood the importance of the records and had prioritized their destruction. This had been planned. And the signature left in the eastern boundary stones, 5 parallel claw marks gouged 6 inches deep into solid granite at a height that no mid-ranked wolf could reach, told her exactly who had planned it. Varen Dusk. Alpha of the Duskmore Pack. The largest, the most powerful, and the most systematically violent force in the Three Mountain region, which had spent the past decade consuming every independent pack it touched and leaving nothing behind but absorbed wolves and erased histories. Zara stood at the gouged boundary stone for a long time. She pressed her palm flat against the claw marks. They were still warm from the friction of impact. The stone was cold. The marks were warm. He had been here recently. Perhaps while she was still on the summit watching moths. The thought moved through her body like a cold current. If she had come home an hour earlier, she would be ash with the rest of them. If she had come home an hour earlier, she would never know what had happened or who had done it, because there would be no one left to find out. She did not know yet what to do with the fact that she had survived. She only knew, standing there with her palm against the warm claw marks in the cold granite, that she was going to do something. She buried them at first light. It took her until midday because she would not rush it, would not compress what they deserved in the interest of efficiency. She found the twin oaks where her parents had stood together at every pack ceremony for as long as she could remember, the trees large enough to shade a gathering of 40 wolves, and she worked the earth with her hands and with a broken length of the longhouse timber, and she was methodical and slow, and she did not stop. She said each name when she laid each person down. Not the formal pack designation, but the name she had known them by, the intimate version, the name that lived inside family rather than rank. When she said her sister Ren's name, she said it 3 times, because Ren had been 13 and the world had owed her so much more time. When it was done, she stood at the twin oaks and looked at what she had made. Then she looked east. Duskmore territory began 40 miles from where she stood. 40 miles through mountain and forest, across rivers she knew and rivers she didn't, into ground that belonged to Varen Dusk and was patrolled by his enforcement wolves around the clock. She was one wolf. Omega rank. No combat training. No allies. No resources beyond the clothes she was wearing and whatever she could salvage from the ash. She began making a list in her head. The list was not of weapons or warriors. It was of everything she knew about the Duskmore pack that Varen Dusk did not know she knew. It was of every grievance she had ever heard about, every faction tension, every wolf who had been absorbed into his pack against their will and who carried that fact like a wound that had not been allowed to close. It was of every piece of knowledge she had accumulated in 19 years of living at the crossroads of 4 pack territories and being the kind of wolf that people talk freely around because they assume the Omega is not paying attention. They had always assumed she was not paying attention. That had always been their mistake. She spent 3 days in the ruins before she left. 3 days of methodical salvage, anything that had survived the fire that could be carried, used, or traded. A short blade from her father's personal effects, its handle charred but the steel intact. A waterproof wrap from the patrol supply cache in the eastern tree hollow, which she had known about because she had helped Dace restock it 2 months before. Dried provisions enough for 5 or 6 days of travel if she was careful. A map of the regional territory lines, copied in her own hand onto a scrap of salvaged leather because the original had burned. She also spent the 3 days doing something that looked, from the outside, like nothing. She sat. She remembered. She reconstructed. Omegas were trained, if training was the right word for a practice so informal it was closer to osmosis, to be the pack's emotional archive. Where the betas tracked territory and the alphas held rank and the senior wolves managed law, the Omegas absorbed people. They felt the room. They noticed the wolf who had not eaten, the bonded pair whose closeness had shifted to distance, the young wolf struggling with the early shifts, the elder who was beginning to feel the weight of age and had not said so. The pack ran on the information Omegas gathered and relayed, even if the alphas who acted on it rarely acknowledged the source. Zara had been running this function without formal recognition since she was 12 years old. And in those 3 days of sitting in the ruins, she reconstructed everything she had collected. The Duskmore pack numbered approximately 120 wolves at last known count, though this was 3 years old and the number had likely grown through ongoing absorptions. Varen Dusk led it with a structure of 6 senior betas, a head enforcer named Call who was said to be the most dangerous wolf in the mountains and completely loyal, and an inner council of 4 wolves who had been with him since the founding of his consolidation project 10 years prior. What Zara knew that most people did not was the texture beneath this structure. She knew that Varen's second-in-command, a beta called Soren, had been against the Ashfen annexation from the beginning, not out of ethical opposition but tactical concern. She knew this because Soren's cousin had been absorbed into Ashfen 3 years prior, and the cousin had passed this information during a pack boundary meeting she had attended with her father, the kind of meeting where ranking wolves spoke to each other and the Omega daughter of the Alpha sat quietly in the corner and everyone forgot she was there. She knew that the Duskmore pack contained within it approximately 30 wolves who had been absorbed from other packs over the past decade and who had not come willingly. She knew this because she had spent 2 years prior to the annexation corresponding with a female wolf from the Ironbark pack, which Duskmore had absorbed 5 years ago, who had managed to get letters out through a neutral trading route. The letters had stopped 8 months ago. She did not know what that meant for her correspondent. She chose to assume she was alive. She knew that Varen Dusk had a specific weakness that no one had successfully exploited because no one had thought to look for it. He was not physically vulnerable. He was politically vulnerable. He had built his consolidation project on the claim that absorbed packs were joining willingly, that he was unifying the three-mountain region under a structure that would protect all its members from external threats. This was a fiction. But it was a fiction that two of the three neutral councils in the wider region had accepted at face value because Varen had been careful and because no one had survived his absorptions in a position to contradict him. Zara was surviving. And she intended to contradict him. She left the valley on the morning of the fourth day. She did not look back at the Twin Oaks. Looking back was something she was not going to do, not yet, not until she had something worthy to bring back with her. Her first destination was not Duskmoor. Her first destination was a place called Holofen, a neutral settlement 2 days east that functioned as a trading post for the mountain packs and was theoretically governed by no single pack's authority. She had been there twice with her father and once alone, and she knew that it was the kind of place where information moved the way water moved, finding the lowest path, pooling in corners, and she needed information before she needed anything else. She traveled in her wolf form for the first stretch, not because the distance required it but because her wolf form processed the grief differently than her human form did. In wolf form, the loss became something she could run with rather than something that flattened her. She was a gray wolf, mid-sized for an omega, lighter than the betas and dramatically lighter than any alpha, with a dark stripe along her spine that her mother had called her signature and her brother had called her tell because you could spot her from the far ridge by it. Her wolf was not built for confrontation. She was built for endurance, for distance, for the long sustained effort that the mountain terrain demanded. She ran for 6 hours without stopping and arrived at the edge of the Holofen approaches by mid-afternoon of the first day. She shifted back to human form in the tree line, dressed in what she had carried in the pack strapped to her back, and walked into Holofen looking precisely like what she was. A travel-dirty young woman who had come a long distance on her own and was not in the mood to explain herself. The person she was looking for was a wolf named Breck, who ran a supply cache and unofficial information exchange from the back room of the trading post and who had done business with the Ashfen pack for a decade. Breck was mid-50s, Omega-born but functioning in a world where Omega rank was less relevant in neutral territory than in pack territory, and had managed to carve out a livelihood that rested almost entirely on knowing things that other people wanted to know and being discretionary about when and to whom he provided them. She found him restocking a shelf of preserved goods and waited until he looked up. Recognition crossed his face and was immediately followed by something careful, a recalibration, the expression of a man who has just understood that a situation is more serious than he initially assessed. She gave him no time to manage it. She said, "I need what you know about Duskmoor. All of it. Starting with the internal structure and ending with wherever the cracks are. And I need to know which of the absorbed pack wolves have contacts outside Duskmoor who might be reachable." Breck set down the jar he was holding. He looked at her for a long time. Then he said, "I heard about Ashfen 2 days ago." She asked how. He said there was a patrol wolf from the southern boundary who had been passing through and mentioned it the way you mention weather. As fact. As accomplished thing. Varen's people were not hiding it. They were not ashamed of it. They were allowing it to be known because the purpose of it, apart from the acquisition of the valley, was to demonstrate that resistance was pointless. She absorbed this. Then she said, "Tell me everything." Breck talked for 3 hours. He was thorough in the way that people are thorough when they have been waiting to talk to someone they believe can actually use what they know. He laid out the Duskmoor internal structure with the precision of someone who had been quietly cataloging it for years, which she suspected he had, not out of malice toward Varen but out of the long-term instinct of an information trader who knows that power structures always eventually produce buyers. She learned the patrol rotation schedules, which changed weekly but followed a pattern that was not as variable as Varen believed it was. She learned the names of every absorbed wolf who was known to be unhappy in the Duskmoor structure, a list that ran to 14 individuals. She learned the location of the Duskmoor Archive Lodge, which held the blood oath records of every pack that had been absorbed, the documents that would prove the nature of those absorptions to any neutral council that cared to look. She learned, most importantly, that the Neutral Council of the Eastern Three Mountains, a body that held significant diplomatic weight in the region, was currently reviewing a petition from Varen to have his authority formally recognized over the consolidated territory. The review process was 4 months into a 6-month window. If he received formal recognition, the political protection it gave him would make any challenge against him nearly impossible through legitimate means. The review window closed in 2 months. She had 2 months. She spent the night in Holofen in the small room Breck arranged for her above the trading post, and she lay awake for most of it with her notes spread around her on the floor, reading and rereading and constructing the shape of a plan that was not yet a plan but was beginning to have edges. The challenge she faced was not military. She had never entertained the idea of walking into Duskmoor at the head of a fighting force because she had no fighting force and no way of raising one in 2 months, and because, more fundamentally, she had understood from the moment she stood at the boundary stone that the war she was going to fight was not the kind that was won with teeth. What she had was evidence. What she needed was a channel. She needed to get the truth of the Ashfen annexation in front of the Eastern Three Mountains Council before Varen's recognition petition was approved. She needed to do this with enough supporting documentation and enough corroborating testimony that the council could not dismiss it as the grievance of a lone displaced wolf. She needed, in short, to build a case. She had built things out of nothing before. She had built the patrol supply cache with Dace using only salvaged timber and 3 weekends. She had built the language she used to manage pack tensions, word by word, situation by situation, until she was the person every wolf in the settlement came to when something was wrong because she had a way of making things make sense. She was going to build this too. She slept for 4 hours and woke before dawn and started writing. The first person she went to was Soren. This was the decision that everyone who heard about it afterward agreed was either the most strategically brilliant thing she did or the most immediately dangerous, depending on which moment in the subsequent weeks they were evaluating. Soren was Varen's second-in-command. He was also, as Breck's information had confirmed, the wolf most likely to have a productive relationship with the truth of what was happening inside Duskmoor. She did not go to him with an appeal to conscience. She had thought carefully about this. An appeal to conscience might work and might not, and she did not have the time or the margin for error to rely on something so variable. She went to him with information she had calculated he did not already possess, information that changed his personal risk calculation in a direction she believed would be useful. She sent a message through a neutral courier. A wolf who traveled between settlements as a trade runner and who Breck had vouched for. The message said only that she had something he needed to know before the council review was finalized, and that it was in his interest to hear it, and that she would meet him at the Iron Pass way station in 3 days if he came alone. He came. She saw him from the tree line before he reached the way station and watched him for 20 minutes while he checked the perimeter, assessed the exits, and then settled in to wait in the manner of a man who is serious about self-preservation and has taken every precaution he can think of. She waited until she was certain he had come alone, and then she walked out of the trees and into the clearing. He was large, as all senior betas were large, with the particular density of a wolf who had been training for combat since he was a child. He had light-colored eyes and a weathered face and the expression of a man who was containing a significant number of reactions simultaneously. She was a young woman who came up to his collarbone and smelled like ash and mountain travel. She greeted him by name and sat on the way station steps without waiting for an invitation and said, "The council review closes in 2 months. You know and I know that if Varen receives formal recognition, the structure he's built becomes permanent. I need you to understand what permanent means in this context." He watched her without responding. She continued. She laid out the specific evidence she had collected regarding the nature of the absorptions, not just Ashfen but going back 5 years, drawing on Breck's information and her own prior knowledge and the documentation she had assembled over the previous week. She described the archive lodge and what it contained. She described the 14 identified wolves who were unhappy in the Duskmoor structure and had potential contacts outside it. She said, "I am going to take this to the council. With or without your help. But if I go without it, the case is the testimony of one surviving Omega against the narrative of an established Alpha. The council will weigh those. With your corroboration, the case is the testimony of a survivor supported by the account of Varen's own second-in-command. Those are very different things." Soren was quiet for a long time. He had the quality that Zara had learned to read as a kind of specific intelligence. The capacity to sit with uncomfortable information rather than immediately converting it into reaction. He was thinking. She let him think. She waited with the patience she had learned in years of managing pack tensions where speaking too soon collapsed the space the other person needed to arrive at their own conclusion. Finally he said, "You know what he would do to me if he found out I was here?" She said yes. He said, "And you came to me anyway." "Knowing that if this goes wrong it goes wrong for both of us." She said, "I came to you because you were against the Ashfen annexation and he did it anyway. I came to you because you are smart enough to understand that the structure he has built does not protect the people inside it, it protects him, and that there is a difference, and I believe that difference matters to you." She paused. Then she added, "I came to you because my sister was 13 years old and she was proud of her first shift and she is buried under an oak tree in a valley that is now his territory, and the only thing I can do about that is make sure it does not happen to anyone else's 13-year-old. The space between them was very quiet. Soren looked at her for a long time with the light-colored eyes and the weathered face, and she watched something settle in him, the way a decision settles when a person stops fighting it. He said, "What do you need from me?" What followed was 6 weeks of the most methodical and exhausting work of Zara's life. Soren provided documentation. Carefully, slowly, in pieces small enough that no single extraction would be noticeable if the archive was audited, he removed records from the Duskmore Archive Lodge and passed them through the neutral courier network to a location Zara specified. The records were the blood oath documents, the territorial transfer agreements, the internal communications that contradicted the voluntary unification narrative Varen had presented to the outside world. Simultaneously, Zara began making contact with the 14 identified wolves. She did not contact all 14. She chose carefully, the way you choose from a tool set that requires precisely the right implement for a specific task. She chose the 5 whose situations she assessed as most unstable, most ready, and most likely to produce usable testimony rather than paralysis or betrayal. She wrote letters, again through the neutral courier network, and she waited for responses. 3 of the 5 responded. A female wolf named Rise, who had been from the Ironbark pack, who was the correspondent whose letters had stopped 8 months before. She was alive. The letters had stopped because she had been moved to a different section of the territory and lost her courier contact. She wrote back in the tight, careful handwriting of someone who has learned to compress information into a small space, and what she wrote was yes. 1 word. She would testify. She would provide documentation. She had been waiting for exactly this. A male wolf named Fun, who had been absorbed from the Crestfall pack 2 years prior and who had maintained a secret record of every conversation he had witnessed in the Duskmore halls that contradicted the official account of his pack's joining. He had kept this record because he did not know what else to do with what he had witnessed, and the doing of it had been a way of bearing it. And a pair of bonded wolves, Tova and Wick, who had been from the Silver Ash pack and who had spent 18 months in a kind of internal exile within Duskmore, functionally invisible, surviving without drawing attention, and who between them had built a detailed account of the pack's actual internal structure versus the external presentation. Zara read each of their responses alone, in the small back room of a neutral way station that had become her primary base of operation, and when she was done she sat quietly for a moment with her hand flat on the papers and said each of their names, not aloud but inward, the way she had said the names of her family under the Twin Oaks. She was not alone anymore. Varen found out that something was happening in the 5th week. She had known he would eventually. She had built the timeline around the assumption that she had perhaps 4 to 5 weeks of operation before the information traffic generated enough noise to attract attention. She was on schedule. What she had not perfectly anticipated was the form his response would take. She was in the Holofen trading post, reviewing the assembled documentation with Breck, when the door opened and 2 Duskmore enforcement wolves walked in wearing the territorial insignia that marked them as on official business. She was behind the back shelving before they reached the counter. Not fleeing. Listening. They told Breck that they were looking for a displaced Ashfen wolf, female, 19 years old, described her physical characteristics with a precision that told her Varen had assigned this search some resources. They said that she was wanted for questioning regarding claims being circulated about the Duskmore pack's conduct. They said the word claims the way people say the word weather when they mean disaster. Breck told them he had not seen any Ashfen wolves. He said this with the specific blank helpfulness of a man who has been doing this for 30 years and knows exactly which face to wear for official inquiries. They left. She came out from behind the shelving. Breck said, "How long do you need?" She said, 2 weeks. He said, "Then you have 10 days. Move everything now." She moved. The safe location was a neutral archive way station that existed specifically under the oversight of the Regional Council Network, a place that Varen's enforcers could not legally enter without council authorization, which required a complaint and a process that took longer than 10 days. She transferred herself and the documentation and coordinated the arrival of her witnesses over a period of 4 days of travel that she executed in wolf form for most of the distance, moving at night, avoiding the established paths, using the mountain terrain the way she had used it since childhood, as an ally. On the 5th day, she sat across a table from a council representative named Elder Voss, who was 60 years old and had the manner of a person who had spent decades being unimpressed, and she began to lay out her case. She was thorough. She was precise. She did not perform emotion, though it existed, a constant pressure behind everything she did, because she had understood early that emotion, in this context, would be used as a reason to diminish what she was saying rather than attend to it. She presented fact, documentation, witness account, and timeline. When she was finished, Elder Voss was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "This is more thorough than I expected." She said, "I had more time than most people in my situation do. I survived." He said, "Yes. That is apparent." She had not shifted since the morning she arrived at the ruins. This was unusual. Wolves shifted regularly, not always for travel or combat but as a matter of physiological and emotional maintenance. The wolf form was not a second self, it was the same self expressed differently, the way a voice is the same person in a higher or lower register. Prolonged time in one form or the other created a kind of pressure, an itch beneath the skin that grew into something more serious over time. She had ignored it because she had been focused, and because the grief that sat more quietly in wolf form was not something she was sure she was ready to put down. Keeping it near, in the sharp human register where it remained at the front of her awareness, was a way of keeping her motivation clear. She did not want to stop being angry. She was afraid that if she shifted and ran and let the wolf express itself, the anger would ease into something she recognized as grief alone, without direction, and she would lose the thread she was following. But 6 weeks of sustained human form operation was taking a toll, and Elder Voss's representative, a young beta named Dale who had been assigned as her liaison during the council's review of her submission, told her quietly on the second evening that she looked like someone running on a debt she had not accounted for. He was not wrong. She knew it. She went into the forest behind the way station that night and shifted. It was not what she expected. She had anticipated the relief, the loosening, the body's return to a form it had missed. What she had not anticipated was the intensity of what came with it. The moment she was fully shifted, fully wolf, the grief she had been managing in human form arrived in its complete form, undiluted. The 6 weeks of sustained focus suddenly released into the wolf body that had no mechanism for compartmentalization. She ran. She ran the way she had run as a child, with no destination and no purpose beyond the movement itself, through the dark mountain forest with the moon behind the clouds and the cold air filling her lungs, and the grief ran with her for a while and then it did something she had not expected, it began to shift into something else. Not away from anger. Not into softness. Into clarity. She ran for 2 hours and when she stopped, high on a ridge with the valley below her and the clouds breaking to show the moon above, she understood something she had not understood before. She had been building the case as though it were a project, as though it existed outside of her, as though once it was complete she would deliver it and step back and let the process take over. But it was not outside of her. It was her. It was the only act of witness available to 41 people who were no longer able to bear witness for themselves. She was not the instrument of their reckoning. She was the evidence. She held this for a long time on the ridge, her wolf form still and silver in the moonlight, her mind moving through everything she had assembled and arriving at a different understanding of what the final step needed to be. Then she ran back. She told Dale the next morning that she needed to go to Duskmoor. He stared at her. She said, "Not as a petitioner. Not as a refugee. I need to invoke the old accords, specifically the sole survivors article." She watched him remember the provision. It was ancient law, rarely invoked, rarely needed, which meant most working wolves knew it existed without having specific expertise in its application. The sole survivors article held that any wolf who was the last living member of a pack destroyed through unprovoked violence had the right to appear before the responsible alpha and formally state the testimony of the destroyed pack, in the presence of whatever witnesses could be assembled, as a matter of permanent record. The alpha could not legally refuse the appearance. The alpha could not legally retaliate for the appearance. And the record created by the appearance would stand as official council documentation regardless of any other political outcome. It did not require her to fight Varen Dusk. It required her to stand in front of him and speak. Dale said, "He will not make it comfortable for you." She said, "I know." He said, "He will find ways to intimidate without technically violating the accord." She said, "I have been managing intimidation my entire life. I am an Omega who has been in rooms with alphas since I was 12. I know exactly what it feels like, and I know that it is a performance, and I know that I am not required to be moved by performances." He was quiet. Then he said, "I will need to accompany you as counsel witness. You will need at least 2 other witnesses. Your documentation must be physically present." She said, "I know. I have already asked Soren. And Rise. And Fun." He looked at her with an expression she recognized from Breck, from Soren, from Elder Voss, the expression of someone recalibrating upward, adjusting a previous assessment, making room for more than they had originally allocated. He said, "When do you want to go?" She said, "Now. Before Varen's recognition petition can be processed further. Before he has a chance to destroy anything else or absorb anyone else. Now." The journey to Duskmoor took 4 days. They traveled as a group. Zara, Dale representing the council, Soren who had made his choice and was carrying its weight with the particular steadiness of a wolf who has stopped pretending he has options he does not actually have, Rise who was quiet and watchful and had the eyes of a person who had been surviving a long time in conditions that required constant attention, and Fun who was nervous in the way that highly prepared people are nervous, the nerves of someone who has done everything they can do and is now simply waiting to find out if it was enough. They did not speak much in the first 2 days. There was a quality of contained energy in the group that made conversation feel like an interruption. On the 3rd day, when they stopped at midday near a mountain creek to eat and rest, Rise sat beside Zara on a flat rock and said, "Tell me about your pack." Zara looked at her. Rise said, "Not the evidence. Not the testimony. Tell me about them. Who they were." There was a pause long enough to contain the entire question of whether this was something she could do. Then Zara began to talk. She talked about her mother, who had a particular talent for finding edible things in terrain that looked like it had nothing to offer, who had walked through forest that other wolves passed through and emerged with mushrooms and bark tea and 3 kinds of greens and turned it into something that was somehow better than a meal plan from a full pantry. She talked about her father's ledger where he kept every pack member's birthday and the specific things he knew to give each person, not just their birth date but their preferences, the thing that would make them feel seen. She talked about Dace, his certainty, the specific quality of comfort she had always found in a brother who was sure about himself in ways she was not yet sure about herself, how that certainty had made space for her uncertainty to exist without being a problem. She talked about Ren, who had spent 2 weeks after her first shift describing the experience in different terms every time, trying to find the word for what it felt like, never landing on one and never stopping trying. When she finished, the creek was still moving and the afternoon light was lower on the mountain. Rise said, "The Ironbark pack had a woman named Sela who made the same kind of meals from nothing. It was a thing our people did. Finding food in hard places." Zara said, "What happened to her?" Rise was quiet for a moment. Then, "She is in Duskmoor. She is managing. I check when I can." Zara said, "After this, I will help you find a way to check more." Rise looked at her sideways with an expression that was not quite a smile but occupied the same territory. They moved on. Varen Dusk's territory announced itself before the boundary markers did. This was a feature of well-controlled territory, the graduated pressure of a pack presence that extended beyond the physical markers into the surrounding terrain. The trees were marked, the air carried the territorial scent claim in a continuous and deliberate density, and the patrol wolves appeared at the boundary in the precise organized fashion of a guard structure that was well-funded and well-practiced. 4 of them at the main entry point. All beta-ranked. All large. Dale stepped forward and provided the council identification that authorized the visit under the Sole Survivors article. The provision required them to be admitted. The patrol wolves knew this. They admitted them with the specific rigid neutrality of people executing a process they had been instructed to execute without opinion. They were escorted through Duskmoor territory toward the central compound with 2 patrol wolves ahead and 2 behind, and Zara walked in the middle of the group and looked at everything she had spent 6 weeks building intelligence on and saw that the reality matched the map she had constructed in her head almost exactly. The compound was large. The architecture of power, scale as message, designed to communicate that the entity which built this had resources to spare for impressiveness. The longhouse was 3 times the size of the Ashfen longhouse. The territorial banners of absorbed packs hung at the entrance, which she had known about from the intelligence but which hit differently when she was standing in front of them. She counted them. 11. With Ashfen's new banner hung freshest among them. She looked at the Ashfen banner for 3 seconds exactly. Then she looked ahead. Varen Dusk was waiting for them in the council hall, which told her something she had not known for certain. He was not going to pretend this was an inconvenience. He was going to make it a statement. The hall was arranged with his senior betas on either side of the central space and his inner council at the far end, and he was seated in the position that maximized his physical presence relative to everyone else in the room, elevated slightly, framed by the hall's main banners. He was exactly as large as the intelligence suggested. He had the particular quality of certain alphas, a density of presence that was not simply physical but atmospheric, the way very large weather systems have a pressure field before you reach them. He had pale gray eyes and dark hair and the face of a man who had not been seriously questioned in a very long time. He looked at Zara with an expression that was almost curious. The almost was the operative thing. She had encountered this expression before. It was the expression of a dominant wolf encountering something that has not behaved according to expectation and is in the process of reclassifying it. She had expected contempt. The curiosity was actually harder to navigate, because it suggested he was paying more attention than contempt would have allowed. She spoke about the night she had come back to find it gone. She did not perform this. She delivered it the way she had decided she would deliver it, as testimony, as record, as the account of a witness who had been present and who intended the account to stand. Her voice did not break. She had decided that it would not break, not because she was not grieving but because the testimony was for them, for the 41, and they deserved her clearest and steadiest voice. She then presented the documentation. The evidence of the planned and systematic nature of the annexation. The evidence of the non-consensual nature of previous absorptions going back 5 years. The specific corroborating testimony of Soren, Rise, and Fun, each of whom spoke in turn, and whose combined accounts produced a picture of the Duskmoor project that was substantially different from what had been presented to the council review process. Throughout all of this, Varen sat in his elevated position and watched with the pale gray eyes that gave nothing away. His inner counsel was less contained. She read the room the way she always read rooms, continuously, with the peripheral attention of someone for whom this was a core skill. She tracked the shifts in posture, the micro-expressions, the specific quality of stillness that different people adopted when they were alarmed but not showing it. She noted the wolves in the beta ranks who were not managing to keep their faces neutral. She noted the wolves who were. When she finished, the hall was very quiet. Varen said, "You have assembled an impressive document." She said, "I have assembled an accurate one." He said, "The council will review it." She said, "Yes. They will. And what they will find in reviewing it is that the petition for recognition rests on a representation of this pack's expansion that is fundamentally at odds with the evidence. I do not expect you to concede that here. I expect it will take time and process. What I am asking you to understand is that the record now exists, and it will not stop existing because of anything you do after this moment. He said, you are making an enemy of a very powerful force for a very small outcome. She said, I am not making an enemy of you. I am making a record of what you did. Those are different things. And the outcome is not small. The outcome is that 41 people's names and lives and the nature of their deaths will be formally recorded in council archives and will not be erased. It is the smallest possible thing. It is also the only thing that was in my power to do, and I did it. A pause. She added, and I note for the record that you have not denied any of the specific evidence presented. The room heard that. Varen heard that. What happened in the hall that day did not resolve everything. It could not. The political process was the political process, and it moved at the pace of institutions, which is to say slowly and with frequent reversals and unexpected complications. But several things happened in that room that Zara had calculated would happen and that she considered essential. The first was the permanent record. Dale's council documentation captured the testimony and the supporting evidence and the fact of their presentation in Varen's own hall, in front of his own senior wolves, without denial. That record entered the council archives that day and would remain there regardless of any other outcome. The second was what happened in Varen's pack. She had not planned this specifically. It had been a possibility she assessed but did not rely on, because it depended on human responses that were difficult to predict. What happened was this: after the session ended and the visiting party was escorted to the way station that had been designated as their resting point within Duskmoor territory, 2 wolves came to the way station separately, in the dark, and knocked. The first was one of the absorbed wolves she had not contacted. A female from the Greywater pack who had been in Duskmoor for 3 years and who had not been on her list because Breck's intelligence had assessed her as too closely monitored. She came with a small document wrapped in cloth that contained her own account of the Greywater annexation and asked that it be added to the council submission. The second was one of Varen's mid-rank betas, a wolf who had been born inside Duskmoor and who was not absorbed and who had no personal grievance with the structure he had grown up in. He stood at the way station door and looked at Zara for a long moment and said, without preamble, there are more of us than you know who have been thinking the things you said today. We have not said them because there was no point. You made a point today. I do not know what that means yet. But I wanted you to know it. He left. She stood in the doorway and watched the dark where he had disappeared. Soren, who had been standing behind her, said quietly, that is the thing he cannot take back. Once the room hears it, he cannot make them unhear it. She said, that is what I needed. The council's formal review of the recognition petition was suspended within a week of the Duskmoor session. Elder Voss sent the communication to the neutral archive way station where it reached Zara and Dale simultaneously, and Dale read it aloud in the way that significant documents deserve to be read aloud, with the full weight of the words given the space they required. The suspension was not a verdict. It was the beginning of a process that Elder Voss estimated would take 6 to 12 months, during which Varen's territorial authority would remain technically intact but his ability to continue expansion would be constrained by the council review conditions. The specific mechanism was a monitoring provision that required any further territorial actions to receive prior council approval, which was, in practical terms, a moratorium. It was not everything she had wanted. It was significantly more than she had been certain she could achieve. She was sitting on the steps of the way station in the late afternoon light when Rise came and sat beside her, in the same configuration they had occupied at the Mountain Creek. Different territory. The same quality of air between them. Rise said, "What do you do now?" Zara said, "I go back to the valley." Rise said, "It is Varen's territory now." She said, "The territorial transfer is part of what the review will examine. There is a legitimate challenge to it. It may take time but it is in the record." Rise said, "And if it takes years?" She was quiet for a moment. Then I will be there when it resolves. I have nowhere else to be. The valley is where they are. I am not interested in being far from where they are." Rise accepted this. After a silence, she said, "The Ironbark Pack. Sila. The others. If there is ever a formal process for reviewing the conditions of absorbed wolves. Zara said, it is already in the submission. It is one of the specific remedy requests. It will be part of whatever the council decides. Rise said, you thought of that before I asked. She said, I have been thinking of it since Breck first told me your name. Rise looked at her for a long time with the expression of someone who has been surviving alone for so long that company, true company, registers as something almost disorienting. She said, you are very strange for an Omega. Zara said, I am exactly what an Omega is. Most people just did not notice what that meant. Varen Dusk did not come for her himself. What he did was subtler, and in some ways more dangerous, than a direct confrontation would have been. Over the weeks following the session, as the council review process began in earnest, a coordinated effort emerged to cast doubt on the witnesses' credibility, on the documentation's authenticity, on the chain of custody for the evidence. The effort was professional. It had the quality of something that had been planned contingently, a response ready to activate if the political situation developed in a direction that required it. Soren had known this was coming. He had warned her before they entered Duskmoor that Varen's response to legal threat was a specific kind of procedural attrition, wearing down the challenge rather than confronting it, questioning every link in the chain until the chain looked too compromised to rely on. She had built the chain for exactly this. Every piece of documentation had been handled through the council's own custody protocols from the moment it reached the neutral archive way station. Every witness had given formal testimony to council representatives, not to her directly, and the testimony was logged with full procedural protections. The evidence of authentication was layered in ways that required dismantling at multiple independent levels simultaneously, which was not impossible but was expensive and time-consuming in ways that began to work against the credibility of the effort rather than against the evidence itself. The council's investigators, who had been assigned to the review within 2 weeks of the petition suspension, found the documentation substantially more robust than they had expected. Elder Voss communicated this to Zara through Dale with a brevity that she interpreted correctly as the council's institutional version of respect. She filed the next section of the remedy requests. The shift she had not planned for happened at the end of the second month. Finn came to her with an expression she had learned to read in the weeks they had spent together, contained urgency. The look of someone carrying something important carefully because they do not want to drop it. He told her that a group of Duskmoor wolves, not absorbed wolves but original pack members, had approached him through a channel they had constructed independently, without her knowledge. They were asking to speak with her. They were not dissidents in the political sense. They were wolves who had grown up in Duskmoor, who had believed in the unification project, who had genuinely thought it was what Varen represented it as, and who had been sitting with the session's revelations for 2 months and had arrived somewhere they had not expected to arrive. They wanted to know how the review process worked. They wanted to know what the remedies would mean for the pack's future. They were not asking her to lead them. They were asking her to explain something to them. She asked Fun, how many? He said, 11 that I know of. Probably more. She sat with this for a moment. Then she said, set up the meeting. There were 14 wolves in the end, 2 more than Fun had estimated, which was a pattern she had learned to expect. Once a channel opened, it carried more than the initial estimate because the estimate was always made before people were certain the channel was real. They met at the neutral way station, formally within the council's oversight jurisdiction, and she met each of them with the attention she had developed over years of managing pack tensions. Not the attention of a recruiter or a commander. The attention of a wolf who understood that people needed to be heard before they could hear anything. She listened for the first hour. She asked questions. She tracked the specific shape of their disillusionment, which was not uniform. Some were angry, some were confused, some were grieving in a way she recognized because she was also grieving, though what they were grieving and what she was grieving were different things that arrived at the same state. When she spoke, she addressed what she had actually heard rather than a prepared position. This was not strategy. It was simply how she operated. But it had the effect that honest responsiveness always has. It made people trust the speaker because the speaker was clearly present. She did not recruit them. She did not ask anything of them. She told them what the process looked like and what the potential outcomes were and what, if they chose to, they could do to participate in the legitimate process rather than simply be subject to it. She told them about her sister, who had been 13, and who had not been given the choice to participate in anything. She told them this not as an argument but as the piece of the situation that she believed they needed to know, because they were trying to decide what kind of pack member they wanted to be, and that required understanding what was actually at stake. When it was over, several of them stayed to talk further. One of them, the mid-rank beta who had come to the way station door that first night, stayed until everyone else had gone and said, "I want to submit my own account to the council. Not the group account. My own." She said, "I will give you Dale's contact. He will handle it properly." He said, "Thank you." She said, "What is your name?" He said, "Tal." She said, "Thank you, Tal. What you are doing takes something." He said, "I have been watching what you are doing for 2 months. What you are doing takes more." The formal council determination came 11 months after the session in Duskmore. It found that the Duskmore Pack's expansion over the preceding decade had included 6 cases of non-consensual territorial absorption, the Ashfen annexation being the most recent and the one with the most complete documentation. It found that the petition for formal recognition could not be approved under the terms in which it had been submitted. It prescribed a set of remedies that included a formal review process for absorbed wolves who wished to renegotiate the terms of their inclusion or claim restoration of original pack status, a territorial remediation process for the Ashfen Valley specifically, and a council monitoring structure that would remain in place for a period of not less than 5 years. The determination was not punitive in a personal sense. Varen Dusk was not removed. He was constrained, reviewed, and made answerable to a process that had not previously existed. It was the difference between being stopped and being slowed, and she understood the difference clearly enough to know that slowed was not the same as stopped. But the Ashfen Valley was returned to territorial review status, which meant it was no longer Duskmore land, which meant it could be the foundation of something, if someone was willing to build. She went back to the valley on the morning the determination was released. She went alone. Not because she had no one to bring, she had people now, more than she had had a year ago, the particular community of wolves who had been part of the process and who had found each other through it. But this part she needed to do alone. The valley was unchanged in the way that abandoned places are unchanged, the damage still there, but the mountain had started the slow work of reclamation. Green things were coming up through the ash in several places. The boundary stones were still shattered but the moss had found the pieces and was quietly claiming them. She walked to the twin oaks. She sat at the base of them, her back against the bark, and looked up through the branches at the morning sky. She had her father's blade in her pack, salvaged and kept clean. She had the documentation folder with the council determination. She had a notebook in which she had been keeping names. 41 on one page, and then the names of every absorbed wolf who had been formally identified in the review process, which ran to 63 more. She sat for a long time. The mountain made its sounds around her, birds, water, wind in the canopy. She said their names. All 41. In order, the way she had memorized them. Her mother, her father, Dace, Ren, and then the rest, each name given the full beat of silence it deserved. When she was done, she was quiet for a while. Then she opened the notebook to a fresh page and wrote, "What we are building next." She had not decided yet what that was. She had ideas, several of them, some more formed than others. A formal neutral sanctuary for displaced wolves in the transition period. A council petition for a permanent monitoring body with actual enforcement capacity rather than diplomatic capacity only. A fund for the documentation of pack histories, so that the kind of erasure that had happened to the Ashfen archive could not be completed as easily again. She had months of work ahead of her. Maybe years. The grief was not gone. It was not going to be gone. She had understood this somewhere in the second month of the process, sitting in a way station at 3 in the morning with her notes and her documentation and the specific hollow of Ren's absence, which she had carried everywhere and would carry everywhere, and had decided that carrying it was not a burden she wished to put down. It was the most honest thing she had. It was the thing that made every step of the work matter rather than simply making sense. She was an Omega. She was the last of her pack. She had declared war on the most powerful force in 3 mountain territories, and she had not broken, not in the ways she had feared she might, not at the moments she had expected. She had built something out of nothing, the way Omegas had always built things. By reading the room, by attending to people, by understanding that the space between individuals is where everything actually happens. She stood. She shifted. In wolf form, the valley looked exactly as it had looked in all the years of her childhood, the particular green of the graywood in morning light, the creek threading silver through the lower meadow, the mountain ridges stacked against the sky in their ancient indifference. Her wolf stood in the ash and the new grass at the base of the twin oaks and raised her head and let the sound come, not the howl of grief, though that was in it, but the howl of presence, of existence, of I am still here and I am not finished. The sound went up through the canopy and into the mountain air and carried the distance that a wolf's voice carries when the wolf means it with everything they have. The mountain did not respond. The mountain never responded. That had never been the point. She stayed in the valley for 3 days before she went back to begin the next part of the work. She ran the territory in wolf form, relearning the paths that she knew and the places where the damage had changed the landscape. She found the places that were healing and the places that still carried the full evidence of what had been done. On the second night, she heard a wolf in the upper forest. Far off, moving carefully. Not a Duskmore patrol, the directional approach was wrong and the scent was neutral, the specific neutrality of a wolf who is marking themselves as non-threatening. She waited. The wolf emerged from the treeline at the edge of the lower meadow and stopped when it saw her. It was one of the wolves from the group of 14. Not Tal. A younger wolf, female, who had said very little in the meeting but whose eyes had tracked everything. She was carrying something in a carry pack strapped across her back. They stood in the meadow and looked at each other. Then the young wolf shifted to human form and said, I asked Fen where you had gone. He did not want to tell me. I told him I would find you anyway. He eventually told me. Zara shifted too and waited. The young wolf said, I was born in Duskmore. I have never been anywhere else. I do not know what I am outside of it. The review process is going to take time and I do not know what I will be while it is happening. She unstrapped the carry pack and set it on the ground and opened it. It contained tools. A hand axe, a coil of rope, a set of wooden stakes for marking territory boundaries, a leather case of seeds that looked like kitchen garden seeds, practical and immediate. She said, I thought that if you were going to start something here, you might need help starting it. Zara looked at the tools. Then she looked at the wolf who had brought them. She said, What is your name? She said, Lina. Zara said, Have you built anything before? Lina said, I helped build 3 lodges in Duskmore. I know how to do foundations. Zara said, Then you know the most important thing. Lina said, What is that? Zara said, That everything starts with what you put in the ground. And once you put it in right, what grows up from it can be very hard to knock down. They began the next morning. 2 wolves, in a valley that had been emptied and was slowly filling again, beginning with their presence and moving toward everything else. The mountain watched with its usual indifference. For the first time in a long time, Zara found that this did not bother her at all.